Here's something that sounds crazy, but is completely true. The United States doesn't just prefer to be the world's dominant power. It literally can't allow another country to match it. Not won't. Can't. And this isn't about ideology or American exceptionalism, or some moral superiority complex. It's something colder. It's about the structure of power itself. Once you see how it works, you can't unsee it. Every base, every alliance, every sanction, every chip ban, every aircraft carrier cruising through some distant sea, it all snaps into place. This isn't random. It's a system, and that system has one core rule: no peer rivals allowed. Ever. So the real question isn't, is America too power hungry? It's, what happens to a country that breaks that rule? Let's start with the obvious question. Why does the most powerful country in human history care so much about staying on top? Why not just, relax, enjoy the wealth, build some infrastructure, let someone else deal with global problems for a change? Here's the thing. The international system has no referee. There's no world government, no one to call when a bigger country decides it wants your stuff, which means every country is fundamentally on its own. And when you're on your own in a world full of other countries that are also on their own, you have one primary goal: survival. Not prosperity, not democracy, not spreading your values. Survival. Everything else is secondary. But here's where it gets interesting. If survival is the goal, how do you guarantee it? You can't just build a defensive wall and hope for the best, because you never know what your neighbors are planning. Today's friend could be tomorrow's enemy. Intentions change. Leaders change. Alliances shift. So if you can't trust anyone else to keep you safe, you have to do it yourself. And the only way to really be safe is to be so powerful that no one can threaten you. Not now, not later, not ever. This is where the United States comes in, because the US pulled off something that no other country in history has managed. It became a regional hegemon. That means it dominates its entire neighborhood so completely that no one in the Western Hemisphere can challenge it. Not Canada, not Mexico, not Brazil, no one. And this isn't just about military strength. It's about geography. Look at a map. The United States sits between two massive oceans, the Atlantic to the east, the Pacific to the west. And it's bordered by two countries that are either friendly or too weak to pose a threat. This is almost unheard of in history. Most great powers have to worry about land borders, invasion, rival armies marching across the frontier. But the US? It has what's called free security. The oceans act like moats, and those weak neighbors mean there's no one nearby who can build up enough power to challenge American dominance at home. Now here's where this gets wild. Because once you're a regional hegemon, your entire strategic outlook changes. You're not worried about survival anymore, at least not in your own neighborhood. You've locked that down. But that creates a new problem. What if another country in another region pulls off the same trick? What if someone in Europe or Asia becomes a regional hegemon like you did? Because if they do, they suddenly have the same freedom you have. They don't have to worry about their neighbors anymore, which means they can start looking outward. They can start projecting power beyond their region, and eventually they could show up in your hemisphere. They could ally with Mexico or Brazil or someone else, and suddenly your free security is gone. So the logic is brutal but simple. To stay safe, the United States has to prevent anyone else from becoming a regional hegemon anywhere. Because any regional hegemon in Eurasia, that's Europe and Asia combined, becomes a potential threat to the US homeland itself. And this brings us to the most important piece of geography on the planet, Eurasia. Picture a map of the world where you black out everything except Europe and Asia. That landmass holds most of the people, most of the factories, most of the resources. If you look at the world from a power perspective, Eurasia is the only place that matters. It's home to about 75% of the world's population, most of the world's resources, most of the industrial capacity, most of the wealth. If you control Eurasia, you control the world. Simple as that. But here's the catch. Eurasia is huge, and it's divided. You've got Europe on one end, Russia in the middle, China, and East Asia on the other end, the Middle East in between. And historically, these regions have never been unified under one power, which is great news for the United States. Because a divided Eurasia means no one power can accumulate enough strength to challenge America. So the entire US grand strategy for the last century has been this: keep Eurasia divided. Make sure no single country dominates Europe. Make sure no single country dominates East Asia. Make sure no one controls the Middle East's energy supplies. Because the moment someone does, they have the population, the resources, and the industrial base to become a true peer rival. But that raises a different question. How do you actually keep an entire continent divided without conquering it? And this is where the brilliance of the strategy comes in. The US doesn't try to control Eurasia. It acts as what's called an offshore balancer. It sits across the ocean, far away, safe behind those oceanic moats, and it intervenes only when someone gets too powerful. Think of it like this. Imagine you're playing a game of Risk, and there's one really strong player on the board who's about to sweep the table. Everyone else is scared, but you, sitting in your protected corner with huge defensive bonuses, you don't need to conquer that player's territory. You just need to make sure they don't win. So, you help the weaker players. You give them resources. You form temporary alliances. You create problems for the strong player. You don't need to beat them yourself. You just need to keep them busy. Keep them focused on their own region. Keep them from ever getting strong enough to come after you. That's offshore balancing, and it's been the American playbook since World War I. So, on paper, that strategy sounds simple, but in the real world, it's insanely hard to implement. Because the US doesn't just rely on balancing rivals against each other. It builds a massive infrastructure of control. And this infrastructure operates across multiple domains: military, economic, technological, diplomatic, every angle, all at once. Let's start with the military piece, because that's the most visible. The United States military isn't just big. It's designed for a specific purpose: global reach, the ability to project overwhelming force anywhere on the planet within days. And the centerpiece of that capability is the Navy. Because if you control the seas, you control global trade. You control energy supplies. You control access. The US Navy is larger than the next 13 navies combined, 11 supercarriers, 50 nuclear attack submarines, hundreds of surface combatants, and all of it designed to operate thousands of miles from home. But it's not just about ships. It's about bases. The United States has over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. And if you look at where those bases are, it's not random. If you draw them on a map, they don't look scattered. They look like a belt tightening around an entire continent. They form a ring around Eurasia: Germany, Italy, Turkey, Kuwait, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Guam. Every single one of these bases is positioned to project power into Eurasia, to block rivals, to control choke points. In the Pacific, this strategy revolves around something called the First Island Chain. It's a line of islands running from Japan down through Taiwan and the Philippines to Indonesia. And this chain acts like a fence. It bottles up any rising naval power in East Asia, specifically China. Because if China wants to become a true global power, it needs to break out of that island chain. It needs access to the deep Pacific. But as long as the US controls Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, China is trapped. Its navy can be monitored. Its trade can be threatened. Its energy supplies, most of which come by sea from the Middle East, can be cut off in a crisis. And this is the key. The US doesn't need to invade China to contain it. It just needs to control the seas around it. Because modern great powers run on trade, on energy, on access to global markets. And almost all of that trade moves by sea. So if you control the seas, you control the rival's economy. You control its survival. But guns and ships only get you so far. In the modern world, the real choke points run through banks and spreadsheets. Because in the 21st century, economic power is just as important, maybe more important. And this is where the US has an almost unfair advantage: the dollar. Here's something most people don't realize. About 60% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars. Almost 90% of international currency transactions involve the dollar. And most global commodities, like oil, are priced in dollars. This gives the United States an extraordinary power: the ability to cut countries off from the global financial system. Okay, pause for a second, because this part is easy to miss, but insanely important. Every time a bank in Europe wants to send money to a bank in Asia, that transaction passes through the US financial system. It might use something called SWIFT, which is the messaging network banks use to communicate. And the US can essentially flip a switch and say, no, you can't use this anymore. We're cutting you off. And without access to dollars and the dollar system, you can't trade. You can't buy oil. You can't pay for imports. Your economy suffocates. This happened to Iran. The U.S. imposed sanctions and pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks, and Iran's economy collapsed. It happened to Russia in 2022. The U.S. froze $300 billion of Russia's central bank reserves. Just took it. And Russia's access to the global financial system was severely restricted. This is economic warfare, and it's devastatingly effective. But the real genius is this. The U.S. doesn't even need to use this weapon most of the time. The threat alone is enough. Every country knows that if they cross the United States, they could be cut off from dollars, and that's a death sentence for their economy. So they comply. They align. They stay in line. Now let's talk about technology, because this is where the strategy gets really sophisticated. In the 21st century, advanced technology is the foundation of military and economic power. And the most critical technology right now is semiconductors, computer chips. These chips power everything: smartphones, data centers, artificial intelligence, missile guidance systems, hypersonic weapons. If you can't make advanced chips, you can't compete. And here's the thing. The U.S. controls the choke points in the global semiconductor supply chain. Not entirely, but enough. The most advanced chips in the world are made by one company. TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And TSMC uses machines that cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. Machines that can only be made by one company in the Netherlands called ASML. And ASML uses software and components from American companies, which means the U.S. has leverage over the entire chain. In October of 2022, the U.S. introduced sweeping export controls targeting China's semiconductor industry. It banned the sale of advanced chips to China. It banned the sale of the equipment needed to make those chips. And it even banned American engineers from working with Chinese chip companies. This wasn't a trade dispute. This was a strategic attempt to freeze China's technological development, to cap its military potential, to ensure that China can make chips for washing machines and cars, sure, but not for supercomputers, or AI, or advanced weapon systems. Picture how wild this is for a second. And the controls go even further. The U.S. uses something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. This rule says that any product made anywhere in the world, if it uses American technology or software, is subject to U.S. law. So even if a Taiwanese company makes a chip using a Dutch machine, if that machine has American components, the U.S. can block the sale of that chip to China. It's extraterritorial control. And it works because the U.S. has positioned itself at the center of the global tech ecosystem. This part always blows my mind. The U.S. isn't just trying to stay ahead in the technology race. It's trying to make sure no one else can even run the race. It's not competition. It's suppression. Now let's tie this all together with alliances, because this is where the military, economic, and technological tools combine into a unified system. The United States has more allies than any country in history. NATO in Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines in Asia. The Quad, which includes India. AUKUS, a new pact with Australia and the UK focused on nuclear submarines. These aren't just symbolic partnerships. They're containment tools. Take NATO. It was created during the Cold War to contain the Soviet Union. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO didn't dissolve. It expanded. It moved east. It absorbed former Soviet satellites, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and this expansion pushed right up to Russia's borders. Why? Because a weak, isolated Russia can't threaten Europe. And a Russia that can't threaten Europe can't become a regional hegemon. And if it can't become a regional hegemon, it can't challenge the United States. In Asia, the strategy is similar. The U.S. has defense treaties with Japan and South Korea. that station tens of thousands of American troops on their soil. It has agreements with the Philippines and Australia, and it's building deeper ties with India through the Quad. All of these alliances serve the same purpose: encircle China, deny it regional dominance, keep it focused on its immediate neighborhood so it can't project power globally. And here's the brilliance of the alliance system. The US doesn't have to fight alone. It builds coalitions. It shares the burden. Japan and South Korea host American bases and contribute to regional security. Australia allows the US to operate from its territory. India acts as a counterweight to China in the Indian Ocean. And all of this is coordinated by the United States. It's not an empire in the traditional sense, where you occupy territory. It's a hub-and-spoke system, where the US is the hub and the allies are the spokes. And the whole system is designed to prevent any rival from breaking out. And all of that would just be interesting theory. But there's one country that breaks the simulation. China is the first country since the Soviet Union to cross the threshold of a potential peer rival. But it's different from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was always economically weak. At its peak, the Soviet economy was maybe half the size of the US economy. It relied on resource extraction and a command economy that couldn't innovate. It was a military threat, sure, but not a comprehensive peer. China is different. China's economy, measured by purchasing power parity, is already larger than the US economy. It's the world's largest manufacturer. It's the largest trading partner for more countries than the US is. It's investing hundreds of billions of dollars into advanced technology, AI, quantum computing, hypersonics, and it's building a navy that by ship count is now the largest in the world. But here's the critical part. China isn't just getting richer. It's trying to do what the United States did. It's trying to become a regional hegemon. It's building artificial islands in the South China Sea and militarizing them. It's pressuring Taiwan. It's extending its influence into Southeast Asia through economic investments and infrastructure projects. And if China succeeds in dominating East Asia the way the US dominates the Western Hemisphere, it becomes a true peer rival. And that's the nightmare scenario for American strategists. Because a China that controls East Asia has access to the world's most dynamic economies: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Southeast Asia. It controls the trade routes through the South China Sea, which carry a third of global shipping. It has the industrial base to outproduce the United States in a long war, and it has the population to sustain a massive military. At that point, China doesn't just rival the US in one domain, it rivals it across the board, economically, militarily, technologically, and that changes the entire structure of the international system. So the US is doing everything it can to prevent that outcome. And this brings us to Taiwan. Taiwan is not just an island. It's the hinge point of the entire Indo-Pacific strategy. If China takes Taiwan, several things happen at once. First, China breaks out of the first island chain. Its navy gains access to the deep Pacific. U.S. forces can no longer bottle up the Chinese fleet. Second, China gains control of TSMC, which means it controls the global supply of the most advanced semiconductors. That's not just an economic advantage. It's a technological and military advantage. Third, China demonstrates that the U.S. cannot protect its allies. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, they all see that and start hedging. Maybe they cut deals with Beijing. Maybe they distance themselves from Washington. Either way, the entire alliance system in Asia starts to crumble. So Taiwan isn't about democracy or human rights or self-determination. It's about power. It's about preventing China from becoming a regional hegemon. And the U.S. has made it clear through arms sales, through diplomatic support, through military posturing, that it will not allow Taiwan to fall. Because if Taiwan falls, the whole strategy collapses. Now let's talk about Russia, Because people often lump Russia and China together as rivals to the US, but they're not the same. Not even close. Russia is not a peer rival. It's a spoiler. Its economy is smaller than Italy's. It doesn't have the industrial base to compete with the US or China. It's not at the cutting edge of technology. What Russia has is nuclear weapons, a large landmass, and a willingness to use military force in its neighborhood. That makes it dangerous. But it doesn't make it appear. Russia can ruin your day. China can rewrite your decade. The US strategy toward Russia is different. It's not about containment in the Cold War sense. It's about degradation. Wear Russia down. Use sanctions to weaken its economy. Support Ukraine to bleed its military. Expand NATO to box it in. The goal isn't to prevent Russia from becoming a hegemon. The goal is to ensure it stays weak and distracted, so it can't spoil US plans elsewhere, especially in the Middle East, or in coordination with China. And this is important, because it reveals something about the US strategy. The US isn't equally worried about every adversary. It prioritizes. It focuses its real containment efforts on the country that could actually become a peer. And right now, that's China. So let's step back and look at the whole picture. The United States has built a system of control that operates across every domain. It dominates the seas with the most powerful navy in history. It controls the financial plumbing of the global economy with the dollar. It controls the technological chokepoints, especially semiconductors. It encircles potential rivals with a network of bases and alliances. And it uses all of these tools together to ensure that no one can rise to challenge it. This isn't imperialism in the old sense. The US isn't conquering territory or extracting tribute. It's doing something more subtle. It's managing the structure of the international system. It's preventing the emergence of any power that could threaten the system itself. And because the US is at the center of that system, any threat to the system is a threat to the United States. But here's the uncomfortable truth. This strategy comes with costs, and those costs are starting to add up. First, there's the cost of overextension. The US is trying to contain Russia in Europe, counter Iran in the Middle East, and deter China in Asia, all at the same time. That requires enormous resources, enormous military spending, constant diplomatic energy, and it's not clear the US has the capacity to do all of this indefinitely, especially as its own industrial base has atrophied. The war in Ukraine revealed that the US can't produce artillery shells at the rate Russia can. And if there's a war with China, the ability to replace ships and aircraft quickly becomes critical. Right now, China's shipbuilding capacity is more than 200 times greater than America's. In a long war of attrition, that's a serious problem. Second, there's the cost of alienation. The more the US weaponizes the dollar and the technology supply chain, the more it incentivizes other countries to build alternatives. China is pushing to settle trade in yuan instead of dollars. It's investing in its own semiconductor industry, trying to achieve self-sufficiency. Russia, China, Iran, and others are building parallel financial systems. They're trying to de-risk from US control. And if they succeed, even partially, the US loses leverage. The tools that make the strategy work start to erode. Third, there's the cost of credibility. The US has made promises to a lot of allies. It's promised to defend Taiwan, to protect Japan and South Korea, to support Ukraine, to maintain freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. But if the US fails to follow through on any of these commitments, its credibility collapses. Allies start to doubt. They start hedging. They cut deals with rivals. And the alliance system